People say you are Iran's greatest living poetess.
I am not a poetess. I am a poet.
Yes, of course, but although there is no difference between a poet and a poetess, I think that one of the special features of your poetry is its femininity.
If my poetry contains any degree of femininity, it is quite natural because I am a woman. But if what we're judging is artistic value, then I don't think sex is the determining factor. Anyway, when I write poetry, I don't pay so much attention to this issue. If my femininity appears, it is quite unconscious. What I think the main difference is that I have never been an imitator.
Forugh Farrokhzad was a young woman who dared to defy societal stupid attitudes towards women. In Iran, she's considered the most significant female poet of the 20th century.
Forugh Farrokhzad, this high school dropout who got married at the age of 17, abandoned her child and husband at the age of 20, had relationships with men which horrified a lot of people, and produced very good poems along the way, and died unfulfilled at the age of 32.
After she published Sin, in her early 20s, she was a great target. I mean, a woman who writes like that and is not ashamed to publish it.
What's revolutionary about the poem is that it's a poem about desire written from a woman's point of view. This had never happened in Iranian history. Never had a woman written so explicitly about her experience in an act of love.
That was shocking. It still remains shocking for lots of people in Iranian culture. I can remember in a conversation with a good friend of mine, the director of the Central Library at the University of Tehran in 1969, 1970, he said, "Michael, I know you like Farrokhzad a lot, and even though she was a whore, I'm not opposed to her poetry."
It was a poem that was written by a woman whose adulthood was being spent in a time among a very male-dominant intellectual platform. She had to struggle in order to get her voice out.
There was one contingent that was just horrified by what Forugh was writing about. There was another contingent that was titillated by it, and that found that it sold to splash her poems across the first page of, let's say, a newspaper, and to have, for example, this is true, an accompanying image of a woman in a bikini or an interview with Brigitte Bardot. So while it was definitely touching on a nerve, it was also titillating for some people, and it was very craftily made into a sensation, and the sensation sold.
I have sinned a rapturous sin in a warm, inflamed embrace. Sinned in a pair of vindictive arms, arms violent and ablaze. In that quiet, vacant dark, I looked into his mystic eyes, found such longing that my heart fluttered impatient in my breast. In that quiet, vacant dark, I sat beside him punch-drunk. His lips released desire on mine. Grief unclenched my crazy heart. I poured in his ears lyrics of love. All my life, my lover, it's you I want. life-giving arms, it's you I crave. Crazed lover, for you I thirst. Lust inflamed his eyes. Red wine trembled in the cup. My body, naked and drunk, quivered softly on his breast. I have sinned a rapturous sin, beside a body quivering and spent. I do not know what I did, O God, in that quiet, vacant dark.
When I've read the poem, every once in a while I think that she actually knows that it wasn't a sin, and she's using the word sin because she still has that tug in her conscience for the basis of growing up in that environment. But she's actually showing us that what society says is a sin isn't a sin. In any case, the poem gets published, and all hell breaks loose.
Many conservatives who did not like this idea, they did not like the idea of a woman writing this. A woman who's obviously writing about an extramarital relationship.
Let's examine how her poem was published. It was with 2 photographs of her, which shows a beautiful young woman. They called her one of the youngest poetesses of the land. And then they gave a pretty extensive biography of her, which included the fact that she's a married woman, has a child, is the daughter of a prominent military man. Makes you wonder, why was it necessary to give that kind of extensive bio for a poem by a virtually unknown young woman? People were horrified that here is this married woman. What kind of example are you presenting to our young women? So all these things, of course, reached her, and every man claiming to have been the man in her poem, all these things reached her, and she lived in a society that gossip shamed you.
But that wasn't bad enough. The guy who was the guy got upset that other people were taking credit. So he was the editor of a magazine where she had submitted that poem and other poems. He wrote a story, a serial story, in which described details in such fashion that everybody knew he was the guy. And several weeks later, she was in a psychiatric ward.
Aside from that, losing her son, aside from that, her father just disowning her, basically. She had no money whatsoever. She went and rented an apartment. She hardly had any money for food. So finally, a friend offered for her to come over and live with her. But all of these things contributed to her breakdown. She used to walk around the house and cry into a hand mirror. She would just look at herself in this hand mirror and cry into it. So she was admitted to the psychiatric hospital. She was in very, very bad shape.
And even in the mental asylum, she couldn't escape the harsh glare of newspapers and various figures. In one instance, actually, an editor said this, and he meant Forugh, time in the mental asylum was exactly proof of what would happen if women wrote, that writing drove women crazy, and that this was the natural consequence of defying society.
Pity that after all my insanity, I do not believe I'm well again. For she has died in me, and I have become idle, silent, and weary. I keep asking the wretched mirror, tell me, who am I in your eyes? But I can vividly see that I am not even a shade of the woman I used to be. Like a Hindu dancer, I stamp coquettish feet. but I am dancing on my own grave. I illumine this sad ruin with flames of my regrets. I don't ask how to get to the sunlit city, for no doubt I'm in a grave's abyss. I possess a jewel, but having terror, concealed it in a marsh's deeps. I go, but I don't ask myself what road, which home, what destination. I yield kisses, but don't even know who stands as a god in my unglued heart. Whoever she was, the look in my eyes changed when she died in me, as if the night's two cold hands drew my unsettled soul into its embrace. Yes, this is me, but so what? She who was in me is gone. Gone. I mumbled furiously, insanely. Who was she? Who?
With each no she encountered, she fought back with an even more furious yes. Yes, I will. I will write. I will live life on my own terms. And so in some ways she was, I think, energized by all of this censure and ostracism.
When she got out of the psychiatric ward, people who knew her well said there was something added to her personality. Not necessarily a tougher skin, but the minute something landed on her skin, she was ready to fight back.
There was really no path for a woman who wanted to write in mid-century Tehran. There was no path forward, and there were endless obstacles. So the women who had published before Forugh, the handful of women who had published, had done so with the support of a father or some sort of male mentor. Forugh didn't have that. In fact, she had a family and a husband and a father who actively sought to suppress her writing. So any path that Forugh went on was a path that she forged herself.
She's asked, where do you write as a woman? And she's going, well, I am a woman, so obviously I write from a perspective of a woman, but the bottom line is that I'm a poet. Does it matter that I'm a woman? Of course I'm going to write from a perspective of a woman.
Why do you write poetry?
I cannot explain why. It comes from the sort of need to struggle with and stand in front of destruction. Poetry for me is like a window that opens automatically whenever I go toward it. It is a responsibility I feel confronting my own existence. It is an answer that I must give to my own life. Poetry for me is, well, I respect poetry in the same way that a religious man respects his own religion.
Really?
Yes, I know it might sound a little stupid, but since I've known myself, I felt that I love poetry. Poetry is my God.
Poetry, as like today, doesn't pay. She sold many copies of her books sold, but she wasn't getting enough from that to earn a living. So she worked for a magazine for a while. So she had odd jobs before she found the job at Golestan studio, which paid well for the time.
They were all planets orbiting the center, which was Ebrahim Golestan. The Golestan Studios in itself was a very, fantastic place. He was way ahead of his times in terms of having, an eye on technology and the equipment you need in lovely parts of Tehran. But it really was the magnetic pull of the man himself.
He was a very bright guy. college dropout, probably knew more than they were going to teach him in college, started his own film company, had government contracts, was very successful, materially successful, financially independent.
He was already a well-known filmmaker when they met. He was many years older than Forugh, 12 years older. And I think Forugh was bowled over by his accomplishments, but I think she was also really inspired by them. And I think through that relationship, she really fully came into her own as a woman and as a writer and as a filmmaker.
Thank you so much. You've been so kind.
She had been in need of a job, and these two people, who were great friends of mine, knew her, and they had suggested that we take you to this place, and I had never seen her before. And she came in just to make a office work, answering telephones or that sort of thing. She could see that she wanted to do these sorts of things, and I could see that she wanted to do this sort of thing. And then the very first thing, the very primary, primitive kind of things, but she developed.
What were your first impressions of her? Your first impression of her? So when in that first meeting, you knew her poetry and...
The poetry was not, it was a kind of a formal sort of thing. But really, I thought right from the beginning that these are not poetry. And I said, yes, you are regarded by people as something, but to me, it's out. I have no regard for that kind of poetry at all. There are poetry. It is not poetry. This is orderly arrangement of words. No, that's quite different from. You could see that there is something in there, but the usual kind of moaning, lamenting, and yes.
And what did she say when you said that?
Sorry?
What did she say? How did she respond to you?
Well, she didn't. She could not say anything. What could she say? If I tell you, for example, your shoes are black, what do you say? No, it's not black. It's green. No, it's black. No. I don't remember if she ever said anything, but she didn't say anything. I don't think that she said.
Of course, Forugh fell head over heels for him. Why wouldn't she? You know? And he too, he saw this immensely talented, young, beautiful woman, passionate, like no one he had ever seen before, no one he had ever experienced before as far as women were concerned. Of course, he fell for her as well.
What was different about Ebrahim Golestan was that Ebrahim Golestan was obviously someone who genuinely and truly and sincerely understood the depth of Forugh's being and accepted and embraced Forugh for who she was. He was not there to change Forugh. He was not there to guide Forugh. He was there to embrace Forugh. And Forugh needed that very much in her life in order to become the woman, the iconic woman that she is today.
For all the time that Forugh and Golestan were artistically and intimately associated with each other, Golestan was married, and he stayed married throughout the course of that relationship.
And they didn't hide the relationship. They went places together. She came to their house. They didn't hide their relationship. And you think people won't gossip about that? They would gossip today, 21st century, if you did something like that. And this was in the 60s in Iran.
She dedicated the whole volume to AG, if you like, or EG in English, a transliteration, if you like. And so, yes, and it's understood that it is there. And I think it is the most loving, mature gift to someone who has been such an important travel mate of yours, and obviously a romantic partner for so much of that period.
Forogh's love poems are breathtaking. They're extraordinary. They offer a vision of what men and women might be to each other if they're allowed to be honest, if they're allowed to be free.
So, you've just published a new collection.
Yes, it's called Reborn.
Congratulations. It's totally different from your previous works.
Thank you. I finally feel as if I'm beginning to write the kind of poetry that I've always wanted to.
Can we hear some of it? Would you mind reading us a poem?
Yes, okay. This is the title poem, Reborn. All my being is a dark verse that repeats you to the dawn of unfading flowering and growth. I conjured you in my poem with a sigh and grafted you to water, fire, and trees. Maybe life is the act of lighting a cigarette in the listless pause between lovemaking. Perhaps life is a choke moment where my gaze annihilates itself inside the pupil of your eyes. In a room the size of loneliness, my heart's the size of love. Alas, this is my lot. This is my lot.
This is a time that I think readings of Forogh's poems start to be eclipsed by this sensational story of the relationship that she has with Golestan. So even though she's becoming a finer and finer poet and an important filmmaker now as well, there's so much attention, I would say, an overweening fascination with this relationship. And in some ways, I would say it starts to eclipse her. So the story of her life becomes the story that people are reading for. It's so interesting that women are either told they can't or they shouldn't write. But then when they do write, the assumption is she couldn't have done it on her own, that they might have been written by a man, or at the very least, they would have been heavily inspired by a male mentor of some kind. And this happened to Forugh, that you did hear assertions that Golestan had either written the poems or he'd very dramatically edited them.
And Golestan, to his credit, is on record as saying, if I could have influenced Farrokhzad in this way, wouldn't I have at least done one poem in my life? But at the same time, there's a sense, and he feels it that way, that he kind of organized her reading. He kind of helped her get educated. He kind of did a King and I number on her in that regard. And lots of literary critics have suggested that were it not for Golestan, she wouldn't have become the poet she became. I agree, as long as we recognize that what he contributed was she fell in love with him.
Can I ask, and you can argue against it and say it's not true, but how much was Forugh influenced by your political and kind of
I just do not know.
intellectual?
I do not know.
In the sense that...
How could I say that? How could I say that? Even if I knew that, I could not be sure that I am telling you the correct answer, giving you the correct answer. No. Well, the best way is to compare what she had done before and what she had done after. Or you just compare the two, and if you see any difference, then you try to sort out how it came about. I just don't know.
But did you guys collaborate? Was there like an intellectual collaboration? Would you run your ideas by her? Would she share her poetry with you? Was there that relationship?
Well, when she was writing poetry, she was reading it to me. Of course, she was. Yes, and if I had ideas, she would consider those ideas. Yes.
What was she like as a person? What was she like?
What was she like?
Yeah. What was her personality like? Was she funny? Was she
No, she was
serious? Was she jokey?
Well, everybody could be funny.
And everything, yeah.
Everybody has his or her moments of happiness or sadness or sorrow. You cannot tabulate that. She was alone. She had been treated very badly.
She always knew her death would come. In fact, when she was in Rome, she went to a fortune teller. And the fortune teller told her there is going to be a sudden death. And she thought something was going to happen to Mr. Golestan. And she was beside herself. She wrote to her sister that she's so afraid. And she said if something happens to him, she doesn't know what she'll do. She'll kill herself. And the death the fortune teller was portending was Faroukh's death.
She died in a car accident, which has again been romanticized beyond recognition. All sorts of narratives have been constructed around this. People like to say that she, stormed out of the studio after raging argument with Golestan. Some people said she was trying to avoid a child on a bicycle or whatever.
Farrokhzad died in a freak automobile accident driving her Jeep or her company's Jeep from her mother's house, I think, to the film studio where she worked, and she hit something, a curb, or maybe grazed a wall, and was thrown out. There were no seat belts in those days, was thrown out of the car and hit her head, maybe the only place she could hit her head and get killed.
There are many, many icons in the world whose progress was arrested at a young age, and perhaps that has contributed to their iconic status.
Her legacy is undoubtedly her poetry, which is so good, so magnificent, but also all that went into creation of this poetry, her candidness, her confidence, despite being so vulnerable and so ambushed from all directions.
She wasn't a perfect woman. When she had choices, she made some that I think we might think are, if not wrong, maybe not ideal. For example, when she chose to leave her marriage, she was also surrendering her child. And that's something that haunted me. The choice that she made came at such a huge cost to her. And I wonder, could I have made that same choice? She wasn't perfect, but exceptional women rarely are perfect. And I think the greater message that came to me as I wrote about her was that she didn't need to be. An exemplary life doesn't have to be a perfect life. An exemplary life like Faroukh's is one that blasts open our sense of what's possible. And for that, Faroukh is an extraordinary mentor and model.
She was a feminist. She was fighting for her right to be able to express herself fully and freely. And she did that despite all obstacles. These days, those kind of obstacles don't exist for us. Yes, we are still struggling, but not the way she did.
Not just for Iranian women or not just for Iranian poets, be it male or female. I think for any ordinary human being, Faroukh's legacy is that brutal honesty and genuine account of the self in a way that nothing can filter it and nothing can stop it.
The last poem she published in her lifetime was a poem called Only Sound or Voice Remains.
And it shows a woman who has reached a point that she says, fuck off. You're not going to rule me. I mean, she tells you, she tells you very clearly, The four elements alone rule me. My heart's charter cannot be drafted by the provincial government of the blind. She's calling them all. You are all blind. What have I to do with the feral howls of the beast's genitals? She's totally insulting them. She's calling them. Okay, so she's basically saying that you are ruled by the howling of your own genitals. She's referring to the men. She's saying, look, I've reached a point that now I will mock you. Now I will belittle you. I'm above you, and you cannot belittle me anymore. My words are powerful, my words are strong, and I cannot be stopped. Voice, 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 only voice remains. And what has remained? Voice, her voice.
Why should I stop? Why? Birds have gone to seek their blue ray. The horizon is horizontal, movement vertical, a gushing geyser. Bright stars spin as far as the eye can see. Why should I stop? The path meanders among life's tiny veins, and in the chemical aura of the afterdawn, there will remain only voice. Voice seeping into time. Why should I stop? Printers' lead letters line up in vain. Lead letters in league cannot salvage petty thoughts. My essence is of trees. Breathing stale air depresses me. Voice, voice, voice. Only voice remains. In the world of runts, measurements orbit around zero. Why should I stop? The four elements alone rule me. My heart's charter cannot be drafted by the provincial government of the blind. What have I to do with the long feral howls of the beast's genitals? What have I to do with the slow progress of a maggot through flesh? It's the flowers of blood-stained history that has committed me to life. The flowers' blood-stained history, you hear?